Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with all of you and to be in so many different ways. Those of you who are joining us here in the Zoom webinar, those of you who are joining us on our Facebook Live, who are joining us through Brookline Interactive Group, through the JCC, and all the many ways. So welcome, first of all. I want to welcome you here to TBZ, to Temple Beth Zion in Brookline. I'm here in the sanctuary where many times we gather together in person to be together to celebrate joys, to be together as we mourn, to be as a community. And as we can't be in the same physical space, I am glad we at least using this technology be together this evening from so many places. So I want to welcome all of you here to this virtual space. I want to recognize our sponsors for this evening where we are here to learn about the impact of science and policy behind the current health crisis and what can it mean for us to go as we go forward. Our co-sponsors to this event are the JCC Greater Boston Hot Buttons Cool Conversations program, which we are very excited to partner with, and also Brookline Interactive Group. I want to thank all those who made this evening possible, that are making it possible. Fiona Epstein, who is the Director of Special Projects at the JCC and a TBZ member, Matt Adwin, AVP and IT, and Amy Eisner, Program Manager of Hot Buttons. Thank you so much, and recognize also the CEO and President of the JCC, Mark Sokol, who's also a TBZ member. So really our community coming together this evening. And we are very happy and glad to co-sponsor and partner with Brookline Interactive Group, which is an integrated media, arts, and technology education center, which serves the community media hub in Brookline and the Greater Boston. And they are broadcasting these conversations also in our cable channels in Brookline. Thanks especially to Ann Faith for helping us with this. And with that, to welcome our wonderful panelists, all TBZ members who are here with us, Dr. Catherine Gergen Barnett, who is the Vice Chair of Primary Care Innovation and Transformation and the Program Director in the Department of Family Medicine at Boston Medical Center, and Dr. Rebecca Weintraub. He's an hospitalist and associate physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She's an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and Dr. Anne Asaf-Biton, who is a practicing primary care physician, public health researcher, and health systems innovation leader, executive director of Ariadne Labs at Brigham and Women's Hospital and at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. So I welcome the three of you who are here in this sanctuary very often, many Shabbatot, with your families and with your children. And it's wonderful to be able to welcome you, to thank you, first of all, not just for being here, but all what you do for our communities, for being in the front lines during this pandemic, for really bringing your voice to the world in the ways you have done it until now. And we feel incredibly blessed that you can do that for us this evening. And with me, also TBZ member, Jed Sugarman, law professor at Fordham and the author of The People's Courts Pursuing Judicial Independence in America. And we will be co-moderating. He'll do most of the moderation this evening, and I'm excited to be able to do this with him this evening. Tell you what we are going to do. So we will have three parts. First, we're going to focus on science and medicine. Then we will focus on policy. And then by the end, we will talk about the emotional and personal aspects of these times. Jed will be moderating the first two parts, and then I will join at the end. And we will leave time for Q&A at the end. There is a Q&A feature in your Zoom, where if you are joining us through Zoom, you can add your questions there. We will try to get to some of them, many of them, as we can. And we plan to end this evening by 9:15. So without further ado, Jed Sugarman.
Great. Well, thank you, Rav Claudia. It's really just such an honor to be here with this group of people and with such terrific organizations. But these four people I've learned so much from for so many years, and I just want to also say it's been an honor to be friends, as well as someone who's learned a lot, and no time like a pandemic to learn from your expertise. So let me invite each of you to just give a brief introduction that tells a little bit more about your experience, that ties together your expertise and your experience on the front lines before we dig into each of our main topics. Why don't we start with Dr. Gergen Barnett?
So I just want to also echo my gratitude for being here and for joining all of you. I think we are very much all in this together. I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight. So, Rob, Claudia really did a wonderful job introducing us in terms of our credentials. But very briefly, I've been at Boston Medical Center for 15 years, which is considered the safety net hospital for all of New England. And when it's not pandemic time, I would love to invite any of you who are interested to come see what we do. So I work as a family medicine doctor and see people of all ages, and I do outpatient medicine and inpatient medicine, and I do teaching and I do research.
Great, thank you. How about Dr. Weintraub?
Sure, thank you, Rob, Claudia, and Jed for organizing tonight. And this is very much, I think, an example of Tikkun Olam front and center, and the synergies between our worlds in many ways. I think those of us who are practicing medicine to see the urgent and global demand for a therapeutic, for a vaccine, really conjures kind of why we all went into medicine to heal and do no harm. So looking forward to the discussion tonight.
Great. Dr. Bitton.
Hi, good evening. So I'm a primary care physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I practice adult primary care in Jamaica Plain at the South Huntington practice, and I have the great privilege of getting to work with people like Dr. Weintraub at a public health research organization called Rna and Dna Labs, which was founded about 8 years ago by Atul Gawande to really find ways to close the gap between what we know we should be doing in healthcare and public health and what actually happens on a daily basis. So we try to create and spread solutions in the areas of maternal and child health, in primary care, in surgery, and in serious illness and end-of-life care. And we're about 100 people and about 150 faculty from all over the Boston area. And it is a great privilege, as has been said, to work in such a vibrant community of learners and seekers and people who do such great work. Happy to be here.
Great, thank you all. So let me say a couple of things. There are going to be some references to some of the great work the three of you have written over the past several weeks. And I know there's a link on the TBZ website and some other resources that give quick access so that you can read more from these three experts. And I also want to note that we've been getting great questions and answers already before the start of the evening. So I'm going to incorporate some of these questions into my own, but please feel free to keep the Q&A going, and we'll keep incorporating, have time at the end. So let me just start. Again, we're starting with the science and medicine in our first block, our first unit, first block of questions. Then we're going to shift over to some of the policy questions of the now, the immediate future, and the long-term future, and then get to the social and emotional. So let's just start, Dr. Bitton, with some of the science and medicine facts. Specifically, can you give us a bit more of an update on testing for infections and antibodies, an update about contact tracing, for which Massachusetts is a pioneer right now? And let me just add a couple of questions we got before the start of the session tonight. We have a question about how accurate are the state and national statistics we've been getting? How reliable are they? Are they being manipulated, or are there some underlying concerns we have about the statistics we've been hearing that are the basis for so many of the questions we have? Second question on this topic is, how accurate are antibody tests? Because there are a lot of concerns about what are the antibodies and how do they get tested? And the third question here are some anecdotes about false negatives. People have friends in their community who clearly have the telltale signs of losing their sense of smell, et cetera, and yet they get tested and it's a negative test. And so there's a concern from people's own experiences and the stories they hear that there's a high rate of false negatives in some of these tests. So that's a lot on the table, but if you could address.
Yeah, all that in just a couple of minutes. So we'll go through this hopefully quickly. So first of all, where do things stand with testing? I think it's important just to know that there's sort of two main ways to test right now, and hopefully a third coming. So what does that mean? It means that the main way of testing is with something called PCR. That is basically a method where you get a swab put in deep in the back of your nose and throat. We take a sample and we basically are looking for amplifying viral genetic signals. So we try to reproduce it in millions and billions of times so we can detect the telltale genetic signature of this virus and tell you if you have it currently or not. That is a good test in the sense that we shouldn't overlook the fact that it's amazing that within a couple of months, the global scientific community created a test to a virus that, remember, probably 5 or 6 months ago didn't even exist on this planet, or if it existed in a bat or a pangolin, some sort of armadillo creature that I've never seen, but my kids say is kind of cute. The fact that we have a PCR test has been really important, but as you probably know, has been really complicated. It's not easy to make this test. It's not that cheap. All the steps that we need to have the test work, from literally the construction of the swab, which, by the way, the main factories for swab construction were very inconveniently located globally in northern Italy. So when northern Italy had its high rate of infection, we had to run on swabs, we had to run on reagents, the chemicals that reproduce these tests, and we've had runs on basically every single piece of testing equipment. And as you mentioned, Jed, there's been an issue with some false negatives, which mean people almost likely, almost for sure had the infection. All of us on the panel have seen and treated people who we were sure had the infection, and the first test or even the second test comes back. And part of that is the property of the test itself, and part of it is the fact that, if you don't do the testing perfectly, or you miss a certain part where the virus is replicating, it can generate a false negative. That has a lot of implications for the numbers that we'll talk about, and specifically the fact that you may see that the numbers seem not just to change day by day, but there are these huge blips that will happen of high increases, and those high increases are almost certainly because we changed the case definition. We start counting differently. We saw this in China, we saw this in Italy, we're seeing it in the US. We've now recently in Massachusetts, and there's really a push across all states to report in a very consistent manner that has everyone reporting both positive tests and almost certain likely positive tests, even if the test was negative or other extenuating factors. So that increases the counts, and it makes, many of you may like baseball, and you're sort of maybe like me watching the daily tally, and you're wondering, oh, good, it dropped off, but then it came back double. Almost certainly that doesn't necessarily reflect the dynamic of the infection itself, but rather the way that we're counting, and that has a major impact. The second way that we test is called antibody testing, and antibody testing is very different. That's when they take a little bit of your blood, and they're looking not for the virus itself, but rather for the antibodies that you as a person produce to try to attack and identify and neutralize the virus. That testing is still in its infancy. There are about 3 or 4 FDA tests, for certified tests, and dozens of others that are not certified, and they are pretty sensitive, which means that they truly are positive when you have the disease, and they're quite specific, which means that they are negative when you don't have it. But the problem is we don't know what it means. And what I mean by that is not theoretical, it's very practical. We still don't have good data that says that if you are generating an antibody and we detect that antibody in this blood test, that means that it's what we call a neutralizing antibody, or an antibody that would actually take out any future virus that you would come in contact with and essentially leave you immune. Now, we know that antibodies are being produced, but it's not clear whether they completely neutralize the virus, whether they neutralize it sort of, or for 6 months, or for 10 months, or how long. And so it's really going to be an important tool and scientific advancement for us to understand whether antibody testing and antibodies themselves generate lasting immunity.
Great, that was really helpful. So now let's shift, I think, just exactly where you're leaving off with the antibodies and the likelihood of personal immunity, now I'd like to ask Dr. Weintraub, an area of your expertise. You've been writing so powerfully and clearly for the public about it sounds to me like global vaccine justice, about access to vaccines. And so I think the question is both about the production and accessibility to vaccines over the foreseeable future. Can you give us an update about vaccines?
Sure, pleased to. I wanted to first kind of remind us, Dr. Vitan, remind us that this virus is novel. So we do not have a scientific base, nor did we understand the structure of this virus as of December of this year. We know it's distantly related to MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and actually closely related to SARS, and that science has helped us propel the science that we're able to produce vaccines today. So in many ways, you think of the scientific energy, the number of labs that have been shut down and are now focused on producing a vaccine for COVID-19. And just to take a step back, we should remind ourselves, why do we have vaccines and what do vaccines do to our body? And they teach our own immune system about the pathogen. It's basically your own protective gear to protect you as an individual, and then hopefully to short circuit the transmission to others. So for COVID-19, the virus, it has this nasty spike protein that grabs onto your own cell and convinces your own cell's machinery to make millions of copies of the virus. Now, without symptoms, your body then replicates the virus, and the virus is invading your own cells. The idea of the vaccine is that we circumvent this process of your innate immunity, and we teach your body how to defeat the pathogen without ever getting sick. So most of the vaccines for the children and adults who are joining us today have had inactivated or a live vaccine. Inactivated vaccines contain pathogens that have been killed, and a live vaccine, on the other end, are made of a live pathogen, and they're highly effective, but they're prone to some side effects. Inactivated and live vaccine are what we consider traditional approaches. And there are a number of the vaccine candidates that use this type of approach, and we know how to test and we know how to manufacture them at scale. The downside of them is that they're very time consuming to make. Most of the material is biologic. That means we actually have to grow them in laboratories, and that takes time. What many of us are excited about is that there's actually new approaches, RNA and DNA vaccines. And if this pans out, we'll be able to get these vaccines out to the world much faster. Now, the downside is we've never approved or manufactured an RNA or a DNA vaccine. So to date, we have over 115 candidates. We have 10 candidates that are highly likely to succeed. And also to celebrate today that the EU pledged billions of dollars to fuel vaccine research and development. In parallel, we need to discuss how we're going to allocate vaccines to short circuit transmission. We must do it equitably.
It's great. So that was really helpful and clear. So I really appreciate that. I think now we shift over to the question for Dr. Gergen Barnett about risk factors. And so the broadest question here is, what are the greatest risk factors for COVID-19? And for some of the people who've been sending us questions, tying right into your expertise, someone's asked the question, this pandemic has illuminated many social inequalities that are systemic and complex. So what are some policies? This is a preview of policy, but it ties into something that you've been on the front lines dealing directly with.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you for that timely, important question. So I get to kind of be a little bit of a bridge from the science to the policy and really thinking about ways that we think about traditional risk factors and then what has been illuminated during this pandemic. So if you look at the CDC, they really talk about risk factors, across the board. They talk about being greater than 65 years of age, living in a nursing home, having chronic conditions such as diabetes, COPD, asthma, which are lung conditions, which put you at higher risk. Obesity actually wasn't initially listed, but we now know, especially since it's been in the United States, that having a BMI greater than 40 puts you at a higher risk factor of coronavirus being creating a bigger illness in your body. It doesn't mean that you are more likely to get it. It just means that if you get it, you're more likely to get more sick. What we're seeing, which I think has really, it's not, as somebody who works on the front lines of a hospital that continues to focus on social justice and health equity every day, none of this is a surprise. But what the person wrote, which I think is so true, is COVID-19 has really illuminated the health inequities that have existed in our city and our state and our country for centuries. And so we're now seeing a much higher prevalence of serious illness in people who are African American or identify as Latinx. And there are obviously a number of reasons that we know this to be true. One is just living conditions. So people are living very close together, and if they get sick, they don't have an opportunity to self-isolate. So we see that infection is spreading faster in those communities. We also know that these communities traditionally have higher rates of chronic conditions such as diabetes and asthma, in part because of food deserts. So people aren't getting access to healthy foods or having to make difficult choices for food, which puts them at a higher risk for diabetes. Long histories, I mean, this could be, all of these could be, 2 hours of conversation, but long history of redlining, especially in Boston, which means that people are having to live in areas where they don't have the same clean air. And we actually saw really good reports that are coming out. I think the Globe is doing some nice pieces on this, particularly in Chelsea. So we see very, very high rates in Chelsea. And if you look at where Chelsea is on a map, you also see that there's an overpass, like a big highway that goes right through there. So we know that there's now an increased link of particulate matter in the air and getting more sick from COVID-19. Other risk factors are incarceration, obviously, knowing that people are in close quarters. And then finally, not quite finally, there's a long list, but really thinking about those folks who have needed to continue to go to work every day, who don't have an option not to go to work, who don't have the security that many of us have the luxury of knowing a job is going to be there when the pandemic is over, and really feel like they need to risk their lives to keep their job. And so we know that there are higher rates in those communities. So those are what we're really seeing. And then I think the second part of what you had asked initially, Deb, and I'll just ask, sort of tie it in very quickly, and thinking about the medical piece of the virus, which is that we know increasingly, and I think this really ties back to Dr. Weintraub's point, is that the coronavirus is just this unknown entity which continues to evolve, and we continue to be surprised by the symptoms that it gives. So initially we thought, okay, fever, cough, shortness of breath, those were sort of the classic medley of symptoms. But then all of a sudden we started hearing about people who are losing their sense of smell or losing their sense of taste. And increasingly recently, we're seeing these very concerning case studies where you have young, healthy people coming in with severe disabling strokes. Because we know now that coronavirus does this very strange thing to our blood where it causes lots of blood clotting and what we call coagulopathies. So you can have tiny, tiny little clots all over your lungs. And even as some people have mentioned, what we call blue toes, where you have little clots in your toes. So those are some, things to be watching for and to be aware of. And I'm sure if we had this conversation in 1 or 2 weeks, we may know even more, but we're working very fast and furiously on the front lines trying to figure out how to best treat people.
That's great, really helpful. We also, as we've had Q&A, we've had a couple of questions come in. One question is poignant here. As a person who is now in her 70s with asthma, will I ever be able to go, will I ever be able to go out safely again if we don't have universal testing? And so I've heard a lot of questions about whether asthma is or how, to what extent it's a risk factor.
So I think that ties in really nicely to our second part in terms
Right.
of thinking about where will we be on the horizon. And I think it's hard to answer questions of will I ever, and hopefully we,
Right.
We very much hope that yes, you will in fact be able to, but I think that's a great question of when and how And how do we know when any of us are going to be safe to kind of get to the next place? But I think that's what we'll be addressing moving forward.
Terrific. Well, we do have a minute. If our panelists want to engage on and follow up on these questions, this is an opportunity to do so for a little bit before we move on to the next part on exactly what Dr. Gergen Barnett mentioned, which is we're moving on to the policy questions. So well, if anyone wants to jump in.
I might just jump in. I think that the theme, if you're hearing, is novelty and acquisition of knowledge quickly. And I can understand from the perspective of public, and certainly from our perspective too, that it can be frustrating. Why do they change their minds on this COVID thing? Or why do the numbers change? Or why are we learning? What's happening is you're watching the scientific process happen in front of you. It's messy. We learn by testing, we learn by mistakes, we learn by experience, except this time we're learning in a global pandemic with hyper warp speed and huge, a sort of huge weight on our back to learn faster and faster. But I think there's also hope in that. The hope is that we have learned so much in such a short amount of time, and we'll continue to learn. For instance, we're going to have a new form of testing, we hope, that will give us a third way to understand this virus. That's called antigen testing, which is instead of testing for an antibody, that's you, or the virus DNA, we test for a little piece of the virus. And you may say, well, the virus code. And you say, why is that important? Because you can do it much faster, much cheaper, and we hope more accurately. And even in the last 3 hours, there's been an announcement that we just cloned the first antibody ourselves to a part of this virus, which may one day in a few weeks or months turn into a therapy. So much is happening so fast.
Great. So this is a great, I think, a good segue between both Dr. Bitton and Gergen Barnett just have mentioned that relate to next steps. So now let's turn to these policy questions. So Dr. Weintraub, we're going to first go through the present, then the near future, and then the longer term. So what do hospitals look like now between your experience, your observations, and what you've been following? Is the curve flattening, or is it a plateau that's going down gradually? What are you seeing out there?
Well, I wanted to take a step back just to have a think why Boston has been ready. And both Dr. Gergen and Dr. Bitton and I were all caring for patients in the midst of the Boston Marathon bombing. And in that time, it was quite clear that we set up systems to transfer, to alleviate pressure on the emergency departments, to ensure we had enough trauma bays. And it really was those protocols that we've taken out and refreshed and used as a system. And serving as one of the transfer attendings, when you're getting a call from a neighboring hospital, they're asking you for relief. And the ability to have the information, the number of beds that we have across the city, the number of ICU beds that are available, creates relief for the provider and creates relief and expedites care for our patients. So today we have actually sufficient beds, we have sufficient PPEs, we have sufficient ventilators, and much of the donations have probably come from people who are joining this call this evening. And the generosity of individuals and the organizational structure within the city and the state has made this availability happen. We also know our emergency departments are being underutilized. And we ask you to come and see your primary care physician or call them first if you have symptoms. But remember, your providers are here. If you're having acute chest pain, if you have a loss of sensation, if you have a concerning new symptom of a longstanding disease, please reach out to your provider and assert and think through, should you be coming to the hospital? The second thing is please get help if you can't get access to your own medicines. We want to help you get your refills and have timely adherence to the medications that you need. And also, please don't underestimate or underreport your symptoms to your family members. They're concerned about you as you're sitting at home isolated. So the good news is we're discharging people home. We've had care providers and frontline workers who've now gone back to their families. We've moved patients from the ICU to the wards and then home. And so we're prepared. We have the right supplies that we need, and the curve is flattening.
That's great. So really, that's a lot of good news and a lot of good advice for everyone listening. So just to turn now to Dr. Gergen Barnett, you wrote such a vivid and helpful op-ed in the Boston Globe on Friday. So for people who are watching here, you can easily Google it. I think it was called The Second Peak, or it was called The Second Peak, right?
Yeah.
And so given that you've written about the second peak on the horizon and a second wave coming, what should we be expecting over the next few months?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Jed. I think a lot of people have used sort of second peak, second wave analogies to really be thinking about perhaps when coronavirus comes back in the fall, right? And really thinking about, okay, what's happening now? What's going to happen over the summer? We now increasingly believe that COVID-19 is not as affected by warm weather as we had once hoped. And yet we imagine there will be kind of a second wave of COVID-19 in the fall that will also come along with the flu pandemic. But what I really want to bring increased attention to is what is going to happen in the next month, next 2 months. And Dr. Weintraub really started alluding to this. What we're seeing now is primary care offices have record low numbers of people making follow-up appointments for things like diabetes or high blood pressure, or even pretty acute things like infections that they think are maybe they could manage at home, or chest pain. And very understandably, I think people have been very worried and scared, and see all the pictures of all of us in our crazy mask. I walk around with 2 sets of masks on and a big, I look like Darth Vader with a big helmet on and gowns, and it looks very frightening. And there are lots of stories, especially in the beginning. I think we've changed enormously in terms of what we are offering providers, but initially we really didn't have enough equipment. And so the rate of infection for people who are coming into the emergency room for things like chest pain, et cetera, was higher. We have that really at a place that feels very safe, very doable. And so my biggest concern is that people are going to continue to wait, and then we're going to have this big pent up wave of people who need to be seen urgently. And then, as healthcare providers, we're not going to be able to quite manage those numbers, or we will, but it will be a real struggle, especially since we're coming off such an intense time where all of us are all in right now. And then I also worry about individuals and being able to access your providers in that time when you need them. So really, to build off what Dr. Weintraub was saying, is to make sure that in order to prevent that second wave, that second peak being as high as I worry it might be, that we're really encouraging people to start coming in now, calling your providers now, doing those televisits now. Actually, I think those televisits are more important than ever. I think we've actually finally got a real innovation on our hand that it was a long time waiting, and we can do a lot of great work with televisits. And then I think as a community, as a society, I think we all are starting to get quarantine fatigue. I think we're all really tired of being in quarantine, but just asking that as we kind of roll into the next month or two, that we are patient, that we continue to keep socially distanced, or at least physically distanced, socially close. And that I think, it was a long time, it perhaps was overdue, this governor's order on face masks. And now it's finally here. And so how do we continue to heed the call for policies that are coming out of the state to make sure that this next 2 months can be as safe as possible?
That's great. And I just really think that was enormously helpful. But you also, I have to mention that if you invoke the Darth Vader mask, I have to wish everyone may the 4th be with you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
People have mentioned that Darth Vader was probably the perfect villain for the coronavirus, because he wears a mask all the time and he is very socially distant and does a lot of his work at a
has a large black crown on his head.
Yes, and chokes people at a safe distance.
Yes.
6
Perfect.
feet.
Perfect.
So I apologize for that segue to Dr. Butone, because you know, at least on this question of social distancing, I think you wrote the piece that went, sorry, the most viral in mid-March, the piece called "Social Distancing, This is Not a Snow Day," and so there was a lot of coverage and a lot of readership. So if you're, for those out here, if you're tuning into a COVID-19 webinar on a Monday night, you probably already have read Dr. Butone's piece. And I think as we plan next, looking forward from where Dr. Gergen Barnett left off to next fall and winter, you know, probably won't be a snow day then either, or what should we be expecting over the next 6 months after?
Well, you know, I think that anyone who takes on this question has to have the appropriate dose of humility, because it's hard to say. And I think people need our best guesses. So I'll try. And then you should also hear from my esteemed colleagues. You know, I think that this will line up in likely one of three ways. And this isn't just sort of my off the shelf comments. These are sort of a group of epidemiologists at the University of Minnesota and Harvard who sort of said, likely this pans out in either a scenario where we're in the midst of the big wave, and while there are probably going to be subsequent smaller waves, they are going to be smaller and more manageable, and we'll know how to deal with them, and we'll turn on social distancing and other mitigation factors more quickly, and we'll have learned from our mistakes of not being prepared and not having the right stockpiles. That's the hopeful scenario. The less hopeful scenario suggests that this was a big wave, but there's an even bigger wave coming, maybe in the fall, more likely in the winter. The combination of flu plus COVID, I think, scares us all, though I want to say again, COVID is not the flu. COVID is much worse than the flu. The flu is bad, but COVID is worse, at least the flu that we've seen in our lifetimes. And the combination of the two is, I must admit, fairly frightening, but I do take solace in the idea that I don't think we'll be caught so off guard this time. I think that with the combination of antibody testing, other testing, plus this thing called contact tracing, which is what the state is putting together with a group called Partners in Health, where thousands of young, middle-aged, and older employees are banding together with the state to basically track down every case that tests positive, every person. People aren't cases, they are people, but every person who tests positive, and then really ringing them and understanding where have they been, who have they been in contact with, and getting the test around them. I think that will enable us, with the combination of supplies and planning, to hopefully stave off the really big wave. And that leads us to a third scenario, which may be the most likely, and you probably don't want to hear this, but is the kind of, some people call it the hammer and dance, or the recurrent wave hypothesis, where this comes and it recedes, and it comes again and it recedes, until either we develop a definitive treatment, a definitive set of vaccines, or both. And that is probably the not new normal, but maybe what I would call the now normal, which is we are where we are right now. And right now we're at the peak of one curve, and we're hoping that we've crested over the top, and it feels like that, and we're coming down. But there's likely going to be another. And so when I see the questions about when can I fly again and see my grandkids, or you know, how will we be able to reopen, I think this is a moment where I personally feel lucky to live in Massachusetts. I think we have strong public health minded leadership, and that are taking this seriously. I have major concerns that other parts of the country and their leadership and our federal leadership is not taking this with all due seriousness. And we will learn whether it's okay to open up as fast as the South and West are opening up. I personally don't think that it will be safe, but we will see. There are 50 uncontrolled experiments going on all across the country. I think that the idea that we just let sort of everyone just get infected, you may have heard of this idea of herd immunity. They tried it in England, it went very badly. Herd immunity is a vaccine concept where you have a certain proportion of the public vaccinated so people don't get the disease. Just to get to, let's say, 15 or 20%, and those are the maximum estimates in places like New York and Massachusetts of people who might have had this infection. Look at all the damage that it's wrought. And so I think that we need to be quite measured and thoughtful. As bad as social distancing is, and we have major economic catastrophe to deal with, you don't have a functioning economy if your health system is overwhelmed and social compacts and social trusts are denuded. So I think that we need to get the infection under control, get the wave crest down, be ready for the next, and then be betting on, as Dr. Weintraub said, the vaccines of the future.
That's great. And I think that all ties together. We have some time for a conversation on this. And we've also been getting more Q&A on this too. So two questions that have popped up in our Q&A that tie directly into what all three of you have commented on. One question is, to what extent is Massachusetts insulated from these decisions happening in other parts of the country? It seems like New England is pretty consistent, but the rest of the country, is there a buffer? And the other question that has come in is a little bit longer, but I think it's helpful to have some metrics about what to expect. So once a peak level of infection is reached in Massachusetts, is there a percentage of that level at which point you consider it tolerable to open up the economy? So if we think about the infection level, and this ties into Asaf's, Dr. Vitone's invocation of herd immunity or community immunity. What point have we crossed a threshold where you think it's tolerable to open up more and get to more from the hammer to more of the dance?
So I might just give a possible answer to the Massachusetts question. And I don't know if this is exactly what the person was asking about, but I think the larger message and narrative to take away is that because the federal leadership has been inconsistent and not fast enough and not scientifically grounded in many moments, every state has had to create their own set of legislation and rules. And so I think similar to what Dr. Vitone was saying, it has been very complicated to have 50 different trials happening all at once. I will say that Governor Baker, who really focuses a lot on scientific evidence and data, which is a phenomenal quality to have in a governor. As a result, I think there wasn't a lot of good data right in the beginning, and so was, in my opinion, and sort of back through what I've seen, not as fast as other states to enact certain policies. That being said, I actually think he and Health and Human Services have done a fabulous job since. And I think the question to this idea of isolation or kind of being buffered, I think as a result of the governor and even the mayor, I think being quite good on putting through certain legislation and qualities. And I think Massachusetts residents being really good at listening. That's why they all read Dr. Vitone's article in the beginning. But I think that people have been fabulous in maintaining social distancing. And so in that way, we are a little bit isolated. That being said, we have very high infection rates. So, that is still, there's lots of reasons that people give for that, but so I think we've done a really good job and we have made a lot of progress, but we have a long way to go.
So let me pose a question to the group here about even at this stage, at the near or over the next few months over the summer. I mean, the experience that I've had over the last 2 or 3 days is it was a lot easier to think about sheltering and quarantining and staying in a house when it was raining almost every day for a month. And then you look outside, kids look outside, and it's beautiful. What's your sense about the appropriate, both our own as parents or ourselves or as policy, about opening up parks carefully, and also to the extent that we don't really know how long this is going to take to find ways that there's no perfect way to eliminate risk, but the idea that parks and beaches with some monitoring might make it more manageable and might make compliance, or we're also seeing all kinds of protests, to the extent that there's a safety valve, right? The other metaphor I've heard is that there's the hammer and the dance. Well, there's also the the hammer and the valve. And the other kind of valve is not just the virus and the valve of the spreading of the infections. It's also a valve of social compliance and the norms. I wonder if there's how you think about finding a medium ground given a certain amount of discontent, or the way that this has become a partisan or tribal way of thinking about the world. How does that enter into what you'd recommend policy-wise and personally? Dr. Weintraub, if I can call on you on that one. Cold calling in my,
Thanks, Jed. I was actually thinking about the Epidemiologic Intelligence Service related to your question. And the evidence that they have is that states that follow and are led by scientists and physicians and clinicians that are leading the information wave have a more steadfast response. And we have the evidence how we need to communicate with the public, and that's leading with the science, acknowledging that the information is incomplete, the virus is novel, we don't understand all the symptoms today, but that there is a singular voice for each state. And I think Massachusetts is an example of that. Illinois has been another, and Washington, the state of Washington, has been a third. And I think we'll likely see that the same, that the public will rely on our health professionals, our public health professionals, to help us ascertain what is safe. Our longstanding neighbor, Mark Lipschitz, an epidemiologist, has been very clear that going outside is healthy. And I think we've been watching people in the public and through the Emerald Necklace practice social distancing while being outside. And I think it does speak to Boston's resiliency and the state and the norms within the state, which are hard to maintain and hard to do. And I think this is one of the situations, if we can do this most of the time in most of the areas, that would be ideal. There's parts of Boston and the larger, you say, well, that's actually impossible. It's impossible to have 6 feet of difference. And we have to acknowledge that as a reality for many.
That's great.
Yeah, I would just pick up on what Dr. Weintraub said. For this, if we're to acknowledge, I think, the reality that this is not a 6-week, it'll be over by July, but this is probably, in the 12 months or 18 or 24 months version, then we can't do this version of extreme social distancing at all times. What we have to do is find a balance and find a risk threshold. There was that question on, well, do we open up at 15% or 20%? I mean, when we're still not sure that having an antibody confers lasting immunity, the threshold doesn't give us, the number doesn't give us the answer. What gives us an answer is a combination of science and common sense and weighing relative risks and trade-offs. We have to be able to get people back to work in as safe a manner and to travel to and from work as safe a manner as possible. And so while running and jogging may, in the MIT studies, to another question, exude a slightly higher, penumbra of viral particles, I think that we can all say that trade-off is still worth people getting on a bike and safely with a helmet and being outside and walking around. And workplaces will open up. They'll probably be at much lower density. We'll probably be wearing masks at work and washing our hands all the time and working in shifts and all these strange new normals or now normals until we get to definitive treatment and vaccine. A vaccine, by definition, if it works, will generate lasting immunity.
Can I just very quickly just add from a health equity lens, because I heard you allude to it, Dr. Weintraub, and I just really want to underscore it, that it is critical that we're thinking about people's health in the entire kind of picture of someone's health. Saying to someone you should go outside is really difficult for people who are living in super dense parts of Boston. So actually, there are places where the city has done a fabulous job of actually closing down parts of streets and making sidewalks double wide. And so policies like that, so we're thinking creatively how everyone could be safe no matter where you live, to get time outside and have at least 6 feet away from their neighbor while they're walking is also critical.
That's great. this has been so illuminating and helpful on so many levels. I also want to commend that, you know, each of you has been, you fielded the Q&A questions as I brought them up, and you also each were fielding them from Q&A. So I encourage people to keep the questions coming if you're on the Zoom call. And now let's go to Rav Claudia on I think some of the hardest questions we have.
Thank you, Jed, very much. And thank you all again for being here. And, you know, we call this last section personal, social, emotional. I would add spiritual too, especially because this is your spiritual home, TVZ. And my question is one has many parts in it, but my question is, how are you doing? Here I'm talking to you as your rabbi, as your friend, in this moment, as doctors, as parents, as people who are doing all this work. I want to ask you, what does it mean to be a doctor right now? What are the stories and experiences that you are having in the front lines? How are you juggling this with having your children who are very dear to us in your home at this time? How do you bring your whole self to this as doctors, as parents, caring for your older parents, some of them in our call, I can see them. So really to be able to ask you, how are you doing? And what does it mean to be a doctor right now? And if you can share with us some of the stories, both the stories that are bringing blessing to you, that you feel inspired by, and the stories that are challenging and that are bringing tears and pain for you. So, Dr. Gergen Barnett, would you get us started?
So thank you. Those are so many great questions all rolled in one. So first of all, just, you know, I think that I'll speak for myself, are so blessed to live in a community where people are really connected through the synagogue and through friends and through raising our children together. So just to have that infrastructure creates such an enormous web of possibility for resiliency. You know, I think I will share on my own personal journey. I think the first few weeks in March, when all of this was rolling out, and Dr. Bitton and I have shared some of this. I really wasn't eating. I wasn't sleeping. It was incredibly. It was all on all the time in terms of adrenaline. Just knowing, like, where are we going? What's happening? It felt like everything was just falling apart so quickly, and there was no clear path forward. And everybody really leaned in. Everybody, I mean, from my hospital at Boston Medical Center, but I really think on a meta level, community all throughout Boston. And it's funny because a place like Boston, there's so many different academic medical centers, and there's kind of this who's who jockeying a little bit, and all of that went away. And I think Dr. Weintraub is absolutely right that some of that stems from the work that we did during the marathon bombing, and really kind of pulling on that cohesion. And so that felt enormously reassuring. And then our hospital just changed over the course of a week, where, you know, we no longer were accepting pediatric patients. They all went to children's. We converted all of our pediatric rooms and beds to adult beds. We built rooms where we never imagined we would have rooms. We had, you know, a bridge over Mass Ave that we created into patient rooms pretty much overnight. And so that was enormously uplifting. And you know, I guess the meta theme is just, it's massively up and down. And I think as we got more personal protective equipment online and more testing online, that also felt like, okay, another step of reassuring moment, like, we can do this, we can do it together. And yet also with incredible heartbreak. You know, I have patients, as I know all of us do, who have died during this pandemic, and died alone, and died suffering. And I've never had to learn so quickly how to have end-of-life conversations. And I'm now part of a palliative care extender team where we're having those kinds of conversations with patients and their families every day that are coming to the emergency room. So heartbreak and wonder as we kind of come together. And on a personal level, I'm incredibly lucky to have an amazing partner who is my best friend and takes care of so much of our 3 children and keeps them and me sane.
Thank you, Dr. Gergen Barnett. It's really great to hear you. Dr. Weintraub, would you tell us how are you doing?
Sure, and pleased to echo having also a feminist husband who's close with Dr. Gergen's husband. That it takes a village to make this all happen, and we definitely live in a different generation. And I was thinking of 2 things. One, I think just honoring one of my mentors, Bud Rose, who passed away 10 days ago from COVID-19, and his legacy of instilling the evidence that we need to practice. The second reflection I just wanted to share is how quiet this practice is. You are placing yourself in a mask and in PPE. You can't communicate. You don't necessarily know or who you're communicating with when you're walking in the hallway. So you smile with your eye or you wave a hand. But there's a lot of anonymity to this type of practice, which isolates yourself as a practitioner. And the second, I think, which is, transformed many of us in the last few weeks is many of those who've become infected now don't have the luxury of distance. They're those by their necessity or their trade. They're exposing themselves and their family to the virus every day. And they wake up and they are serving us by delivering food, by carrying the mail, by driving the buses. And now they've come into the hospital in waves. And just thinking about who can practice this idea of distancing themselves, and many in our city cannot. So I think about the quiet and the distance, and I know this too shall pass.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weintraub. Dr. Bitton.
Well, echo a lot of what my colleagues said. I think that this has certainly been one of the great professional and personal challenges of certainly my life. I think many of ours. I mean, as Dr. Weintraub said, we were in the ERs and hospitals on the marathon bombing, but that was really, it was something awful, but this is just sort of, it's like never ending. And I think that so when you ask how, most of us say, when you ask how we are, we say we're fine. I think that's mostly true some of the time, most of the time, but it's not true all of the time. I mean, it's never ending. You feel like your work is never done. You work in service of your patients, you work in service of your hospital, you work in service of, all of us do a lot of public health, and you're surrounded by the largest and most unprecedented pandemic and health challenge of our lives in our century. And it's like, can you rest? Can you take a break? And so we come back to, all of us only are able to do any work or be of any service because we are so lucky to live with and be loved by our partners and our extended families and our friends. And it resonates what Dr. Weintraub said, that despite that, it is a lonely, even more lonely than I've ever experienced. When you're in the moon suits or versions of the moon suits, you just feel totally distant. You have no idea who you're walking in to see or who you're not bumping into. You don't really talk so much. The usual chatter of clinical care is very different. It is eerie, it is quiet, it is strange. And you've sort of made your peace a little bit with this idea that you're dealing with a nemesis that, despite your best efforts, you may get infected. And this is what you signed up for. And I don't know. I mean, I appreciate that people say it's courageous and heroes and stuff like that. It doesn't resonate. I mean, all 3 of us, I know these panelists very, very well. We know what we signed up for. We made our peace with this a long time ago. We didn't necessarily think that we would have to deal with as dangerous a foe as this. And so it's difficult, but it's necessary. And it's what we would want if we were sick, and it's what we do to support our communities, because this is our chosen profession, as is the chosen profession of nurses and phlebotomists and janitors, all the people who exist to support this incredible health ecosystem. they're here and they show up every day. And that to me is the most amazing, deeply spiritual statement that I can imagine, that when it is necessary, people do. They do their best. It's not always perfect, but they do, and they do their best and they keep showing up. That is incredibly resonant for me and helps me get through the ups and the downs.
Thank you, Dr. Vitton. You have me here with tears, really listening to what you're saying, and really that we are all here trying to do our best and really hold this time, which is so challenging, together. And we're very blessed that to have you being part of our community. I want to ask the three of you if there's anything else you would like to add to any of the things that have been said this evening, to respond to something that your colleagues have said, or to Jed or to me, that you would like to add, to share with everybody. And then we'll try to see if there, you have responded so many questions from the Q&A during it that we don't have to do each question now, but if there's anything you would like to add to this conversation.
I think I would just like to add, there's so many reflections that we've shared, but I think there's, so many people who have joined us this evening, that as part of the practice and part of what I'm inviting my medical community and sort of colleagues at this point to start thinking about is, how do we start preparing for a post-COVID-19 world? It's almost impossible to imagine at this point, but where are there places, and I'm an inherent optimist, right? Even though there's been a lot of dark, where are there places that have really resonated with you over this time? Is it, not the quiet, the lonely quiet, but where, is there kind of a sense of increased quiet that you've had in your life, or a place to kind of really see what has mattered, and people that you need to connect to, or practices? For me, it's turning more to the poetry, and we've, our little meditation nook has gotten more love recently, and things that you want to sort of carry out of this journey, and out of this desert, because I think that there is a lot of lessons to be learned, not just from medicine, but for all of us. And how do we start sharing those stories and those conversations now, as communities?
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Weintraub, Dr. Vitton, anything you would like to add?
Well, I want to thank you, Rav Claudia, because tuning at the end of Shabbat has helped give me a sense of this is a new week. There's a sense of iteration. There's a sense of the next 6.5 days will come with new highs and lows, but the actual practice of Shabbat and the practice of ending Shabbat and saying Shavua Tov. And the first time we had a TBZ Shiva call on Zoom, and watching our diverse community understand how to use the technology and share these beautiful stories of a lost one, just reminded us about the practice itself and the sense of renewal. So thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to echo my thanks as well. It's like we in our household, it's the highlight of our week, and having, we talk a lot about Zoom fatigue, and it's quite real, of course, and yet I think this is giving us an opportunity to explore new facets and fortunately try new things, whether it's learning by distance or practicing medicine by distance. Those are things that will continue in some form, in a better form, hopefully when we can hybridize them. But the most amazing thing has been sort of spirituality through technology, which I have to admit, I thought they were, totally separate things. I've gone to bat mitzvahs, shivas, my nephew's bris, Shabbat every week, other holiday, Pesach Seders. And they've found deep meaning in them. And what does that teach us about ways that what is true connection? It's obviously in person, but how can it be facilitated through technology? And also the inclusionary power of technology when this is over. I wonder, not to ask you a question, Rav Claudia, but can we keep the Zoom on for the people that can't walk to shul or that can't get there? Can we find ways in our milestone and life moments to include people who couldn't make the trip? I think a lot about that, because I think the answer will probably be, to some extent, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Asaf. I think Dr. Bitton. Sorry, that was a personal one. Dr. Bitton, thank you. I think that, we are, and I think it's very interesting, we are in these parallel conversations around synagogues and communities. We're talking about this in our own synagogue, and with our board, we had this same conversation on Thursday night at a board meeting, and I've been having conversation with other colleagues. So what are the things that we keep and that we can continue? So yes, we are looking into that, and I think it's very important we figure out what is working that actually can bring us together closer, even when there is no COVID. I have a question for you from me, which is, what can we do as your friends and congregants and rabbis to support you in this incredibly holy work? And what are the things that you need from the wider community? What can the non-doctors do to support the work that ahead for you for the long run? Because as you said, this is not just 3 months. This is 18 months. This will take time. So, what do you say?
I will say that I actually think we all have a role to play in this. It is, we're a panel of 3 physicians. I think that, as Dr. Weintraub mentioned, every single person, whether they are working to take the trash out in the hospital, or continue to make food, or do amazing prayers that begin and end our Shabbat. It is such a, not to be Pollyannish, it is a complete effort, a joint effort. And I wouldn't ask anything more than what people are doing. I actually feel like, personally, and I think that Dr. Bitton also said it, we are doing a lot of work, but we're not doing extraordinary work. We're doing what we were called to do. And, having everybody sort of lean into what they're called to do, and not despair if it's not medical work. Not everybody needs to be doing the medical work. We still need singers and dancers and writers and parents and people who plant beautiful things. So I would just already say that keep doing what you're doing, and lean into it.
Yeah, I would echo that so much, Dr. Gergen Barnett. I mean, I would like people to take care of themselves. I would like them to reach out to us and never worry alone. We talk about this a lot, but we can never say it enough. Never worry alone. Share your worries, share your concerns about physical or mental ailments as they come up, about your worries and fears. We in the medical profession can and want to hear from you. We don't want you to sit at home. Take care of your loved ones. Check in on people that you haven't checked in on. Contribute to your communities in all the ways that was just said. Support local bookstores and artists and writers and all the and restaurants, and buy the gift certificates or GoFundMe pages, all those things that that you're already doing. Do more of it. That's how you can support us, because it's not about us. It's actually about how we build and create vibrant, inclusive communities that we continue to want to live with after this is over. And there will be an over. I promise you, this will be over. Don't know what date that will be on, but it will be, and we will get through it, and we will look back on this. And remember when we had that crazy call on the Thursday, I don't even know what night it is, Monday night, whatever night it is, it's all the same. And you remember when we couldn't be together? Well, now we can be together. Isn't that so much better? And I hope that we can take that level of civility and that level of love for the mundane, for this moment that we could before we just say, oh, well, I'll see you down the street. No, it is so good to see you. It is so good to embrace you when we can.
Amen.
That will be a great thing. So live for that day, and we will get there together. And we just need to keep taking care of ourselves and take care of the people who are not on these calls and not able to always be forefront in our mind. Remember the most vulnerable.
Thank you, Dr. Bitton. Jed, do you want to say anything to our wonderful panelists?
I just want to say how extraordinary this was. It is so remarkable to be able to talk to experts who have such a command and have played such a prominent role locally and nationally with the hard science and the hard questions. Just briefly, just one of the reasons why we planned this panel was that so many of us had some similar observations. I had a moment where we were speaking to a Holocaust survivor who was 5 years old during the Holocaust, and he made this observation that there's such a difference between the trauma of the experience of the Holocaust and observing, and at the end of his life, observing a pandemic where we were in bubbles within bubbles. And part of what he wanted us to appreciate is that the experience, he was speaking to my high school student, my oldest son, and what he was saying to the group was the memories that you have as children, as a child Holocaust survivor, I'm sharing my stories with you, but I want you to just recognize, someone asked him, what his wisdom was for this moment. And he said just how different this was, because we are sitting at home and maybe we're watching and reading, but we're so removed from the front lines. And to be able to talk to such experts with such depth of expertise and such emotional depth is just so remarkable. And what you brought here tonight of your minds and your hearts and your souls has been something that's I think so helpfully pierced a bubble to allow us to really understand what it's like on the front line. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jed, so much for those words. And I want to thank you, the three of you, Dr. Gergen Barnett, Dr. Weintraub, and Dr. Bitton, for being here, for all the work that you have been doing, and everybody that has joined us this evening. Thank you to the JCC and to Brooklyn Interactive Group for co-sponsoring this event. And I want to end by just blessing the three of you, blessing all of us, but blessing the three of you, and not letting you know, telling you that you are in our prayers and my prayers, you and all the health workers and all those who are in the front lines, and that we feel very blessed to have you in our community. As you know, often when we are in this sanctuary, you can't see it, but I can see it, and I know where you would see it, exactly where you have your places. We sing and we pray, may we be able to build a sanctuary where the presence of divine can reside in it. And I feel incredibly grateful that we have you helping us build that sanctuary, and so many of in our community, to build a sanctuary where the presence of the divine can live with it, in it, and with us. So we'll continue doing that work all together. So thank you again for being here. Thank you for your work. Know you are part of this community that loves you and cares for you. And thank you, Jed, for being an amazing moderator. And thank you all for keeping everything on time. We rock it this night. So thank you all, and have a great night, everybody. Stay healthy, wear your mask, stay 6 feet apart, and wash your hands. Did I get them all? Thank you.
Thank you.